They were farmers, lumberjacks, factory workers, boys who'd never held a rifle until 1939. And British generals looked at them with contempt, calling them undisciplined, reckless, amateur soldiers who fight like civilians. But by 1945, these so-called civilians had killed more than 380,000 enemy soldiers, liberated entire nations, and earned a reputation so terrifying that German commanders would rather face seasoned British or American divisions than encounter Canadians in battle. This is the story of how the most underestimated army in World War II became the most feared fighting force on the Western Front. Before we dive into this incredible history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because you won't want to miss stories like this. Drop a comment below telling us what you think about Canada's hidden military legacy, and smash that like button if you believe these heroes deserve recognition. The contempt started before a single shot was fired. When Canadian troops arrived in Britain in 1939 and early 1940, British military leadership observed their training with barely concealed disdain. These weren't the polished, parade ground soldiers of the British Empire. Canadian troops were rowdy, informal, and seemed to treat military discipline as a suggestion rather than law. Officers fraternized with enlisted men. Soldiers questioned orders. Units operated with a looseness that made British commanders shake their heads in disgust. One British general wrote in his personal diary that Canadian soldiers lacked the martial bearing and discipline essential to modern warfare, and predicted they would crumble under sustained enemy pressure. Another observer noted that Canadians treat warfare like a dangerous job rather than a sacred duty, completely missing what would become their greatest strength. The British military establishment, steeped in centuries of rigid tradition, simply couldn't comprehend a different approach to warfare. What British generals failed to recognize was that these men brought something no amount of parade ground drilling could teach. They brought practical problem-solving skills honed in the unforgiving Canadian wilderness. They brought an egalitarian culture where good ideas mattered more than rank. They brought adaptability born from surviving brutal winters and harsh frontier conditions. Most importantly, they brought a fierce determination to finish the job and get home, which meant fighting smarter and harder than any traditional army. The first test came at Hong Kong in December 1941, and it seemed to confirm every British prejudice. 2 Canadian battalions, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, were sent to reinforce the supposedly impregnable fortress. They'd barely arrived when Japanese forces attacked. The battle was a massacre, with nearly 300 Canadians killed and the rest captured after a desperate 18-day defense. British observers nodded knowingly. Civilians playing soldier had met professional warriors and been crushed. But they'd misread everything. Those Canadian defenders had faced overwhelming odds against battle-hardened Japanese troops with air superiority, naval superiority, and a 5-to-1 numerical advantage. Despite inadequate equipment, insufficient training time, and being thrust into an impossible situation, Canadian troops had fought with such ferocity that Japanese commanders later expressed shock at their resistance. One Japanese officer's report described Canadian defenders as unexpectedly savage, and noted they refused surrender even in hopeless positions. The real revelation came at Dieppe on August 19, 1942. This would be the bloodiest day in Canadian military history, with 3,367 casualties out of 4,963 men who landed on those beaches. Nearly 60% casualties. British planners had designed the raid, and when it turned into a slaughter, many used it as final proof that Canadians couldn't handle modern warfare. But once again they'd completely misunderstood what happened. Dieppe wasn't a failure of Canadian courage or capability. It was a catastrophic failure of planning and intelligence. Canadian troops landed on beaches that were supposed to be lightly defended but were actually fortified death traps. They were supposed to have air cover that never materialized. They were promised surprise, but the Germans were waiting. Despite everything going wrong from the first second, Canadian soldiers fought with such intensity that German defenders later reported being stunned by their aggression and disturbed by their refusal to accept defeat. The Germans learned something at Dieppe that British generals still didn't grasp. These Canadians were not soft colonial troops. They were something new and dangerous. One German after-action report noted with concern that Canadian wounded continued fighting when German troops would have surrendered. Another described Canadian soldiers adapting tactics in real time, turning a disaster into a bitter, costly engagement that German defenders would never forget. The Wehrmacht started paying attention to Canadian units in ways they never had before. What happened next would rewrite the reputation of Canadian forces forever. In July 1943, Canadians spearheaded the invasion of Sicily as part of Operation Husky. British commanders still doubted them, assigning the 1st Canadian Infantry Division to what they assumed would be a secondary role. Instead, Canadians smashed through Italian and German defensive positions with such speed and violence that Allied commanders scrambled to adjust their entire operational plan. The Sicilian campaign revealed the Canadian way of war. They didn't fight by the book because they'd never read the book. When confronted with heavily defended positions, they didn't wait for artillery preparation or reinforcements. They studied the terrain, found weaknesses, and hit hard where the enemy was most vulnerable. When roads were blocked, they went cross-country. When frontal assault was suicidal, they flanked. When night fell and other armies dug in, Canadians attacked under cover of darkness. This wasn't recklessness. This was intelligent aggression. Canadian officers encouraged initiative at every level. A corporal who spotted an opportunity could make decisions that would require 3 levels of approval in British units. This meant Canadian forces moved faster, adapted quicker, and exploited opportunities that more rigid armies let slip away. German commanders started noting in their reports that Canadian attacks came from unexpected directions at unexpected times with unexpected violence. The liberation of Italy became a Canadian showcase. While British and American forces struggled in the mountainous terrain, Canadians fought their way up the peninsula with devastating efficiency. They crossed rivers that were supposed to be uncrossable. They took towns that were supposed to be impregnable. They maintained offensive pressure when other Allied units needed rest and reorganization. The tempo of Canadian operations forced German commanders into a constant defensive posture, never allowing them to establish strong positions. At Ortona in December 1943, the world got a brutal education in Canadian urban warfare capabilities. The medieval town had been turned into a fortress by elite German paratroopers who were determined to stop the Allied advance. House-to-house fighting lasted for 8 days of the most savage close-quarters combat of the entire Italian campaign. German defenders, veterans of Stalingrad and Monte Cassino, expected Canadians to eventually exhaust themselves and withdraw. Instead, Canadians invented new urban warfare tactics on the spot. They developed mouse-holing, blasting through walls to move between buildings without exposing themselves to street fire. They used explosives in ways that shocked German engineers. They fought with bayonets, grenades, and bare hands through smoke and rubble and darkness. When German paratroopers finally withdrew from Ortona, they'd lost more than 1,300 men. They'd faced what they now called Little Stalingrad, and the Canadians who emerged from that hellscape were harder, meaner, and more confident than any force in the Allied armies. British generals could no longer dismiss Canadian capabilities. The evidence was overwhelming. Canadian divisions were consistently outperforming British units in the same sectors under the same conditions. They were taking objectives faster, with fewer casualties, and maintaining operational tempo that exhausted German defenders. Most tellingly, German intelligence began identifying Canadian units and warning their troops that Canadian attacks required special defensive measures and extra vigilance. As D-Day approached, Canadian forces were assigned critical objectives at Juno Beach. This wasn't charity or symbolism. This was recognition that when you needed a heavily defended beach taken quickly and held against counterattack, you gave the job to Canadians. On June 6, 1944, Canadian troops proved why. They landed on beaches swept by machine gun fire, churned by artillery, and covered by German defenders in hardened bunkers. Within hours, they'd punched deeper inland than any other Allied force, including veteran American and British divisions. The advance from Juno Beach became legendary. While other sectors struggled to secure their beachheads, Canadians pushed so far inland that German commanders feared their entire defensive line would collapse. By nightfall on D-Day, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had advanced nearly 9 miles, further than any other Allied unit. They'd taken heavily fortified positions, linked up with British forces, and established defensive positions that threatened German strategic reserves. More importantly, they'd done it with lower casualties than intelligence had predicted, because Canadian tactics emphasized speed and aggression over methodical advance. Now the pattern became unmistakable. Throughout the Battle of Normandy, Canadian forces consistently exceeded expectations. They took Caen after British forces stalled. They closed the Falaise Gap, trapping entire German armies. They advanced through France and Belgium faster than logistics could support them, forcing supply officers to improvise just to keep Canadian spearheads moving. German commanders began referring to the Canadian sectors as crisis points, where breakthrough was most likely. The transformation was complete when Canadians were assigned to clear the Scheldt estuary in October 1944. This was arguably the toughest assignment of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The terrain was nightmarish: flooded polders, narrow dikes, heavily fortified islands, all defended by fanatical German troops who'd been ordered to hold at all costs. British commanders estimated it would take months and cost tens of thousands of casualties. They gave the mission to the 1st Canadian Army, now recognized as the most effective fighting force available. What followed was a masterpiece of military operations. Canadian forces attacked through flooded terrain that military experts had declared impassable. They assaulted fortified positions from multiple directions simultaneously. They maintained pressure day and night, never allowing German defenders to rest or reinforce. They used combined arms tactics with artillery, armor, infantry, and engineers working in seamless coordination. The operation was completed in 5 weeks with roughly 12,800 casualties, far fewer than pessimistic projections, and it opened the vital port of Antwerp to Allied shipping. The German army now feared Canadian forces above all others. Captured German officers expressed genuine respect mixed with dread when discussing Canadian operations. One Wehrmacht colonel stated during interrogation that Canadian soldiers fight with British equipment, American supplies, and Russian fury. Another noted that defending against Canadians requires constant alertness because they attack when you believe attack is impossible. German defensive doctrine was literally being rewritten to address the Canadian threat. By early 1945, the contrast with Soviet operations under Zhukov became stark. Yes, Soviet forces were grinding toward Berlin through sheer mass and horrific casualties. Marshal Zhukov commanded millions of men and accepted staggering losses to maintain momentum. Soviet operations were sledgehammers, crushing everything through weight and numbers. Canadian operations were rapiers, precise and devastating, achieving strategic objectives with a fraction of the forces and casualties. The numbers tell the story. From D-Day to V-Day, roughly 240,000 Canadian soldiers fighting in Northwest Europe killed or captured an estimated 380,000 German soldiers. They liberated the Netherlands, northern France, Belgium, and significant portions of northwestern Germany. They maintained an operational tempo that consistently exceeded Soviet advances despite fighting with vastly smaller forces against prepared German defenses on interior lines. Pound for pound, man for man, no army in World War II was more effective than Canadian forces in 1944 and 1945. The liberation of the Netherlands revealed why Canadians inspired such loyalty. Other armies liberated territory. Canadians liberated people. They shared their rations with starving Dutch civilians. They gave their coats to freezing children. They played with kids in devastated towns. They treated the Dutch not as conquered territory but as friends who'd suffered under Nazi occupation. Dutch civilians would remember for generations that when freedom came, it came with a Canadian accent. The medieval town had been turned into a fortress by elite German paratroopers who were determined to stop the Allied advance. House-to-house fighting lasted for 8 days of the most savage close-quarters combat of the entire Italian campaign. German defenders, veterans of Stalingrad and Monte Cassino, expected Canadians to eventually exhaust themselves and withdraw. Instead, Canadians invented new urban warfare tactics on the spot. They developed mouse-holing, blasting through walls to move between buildings without exposing themselves to street fire. They used explosives in ways that shocked German engineers. They fought with bayonets, grenades, and bare hands through smoke and rubble and darkness. When German paratroopers finally withdrew from Ortona, they'd lost more than 1,300 men. They'd faced what they now called Little Stalingrad, and the Canadians who emerged from that hellscape were harder, meaner, and more confident than any force in the Allied armies. British generals could no longer dismiss Canadian capabilities. The evidence was overwhelming. Canadian divisions were consistently outperforming British units in the same sectors under the same conditions. They were taking objectives faster, with fewer casualties, and maintaining operational tempo that exhausted German defenders. Most tellingly, German intelligence began identifying Canadian units and warning their troops that Canadian attacks required special defensive measures and extra vigilance. As D-Day approached, Canadian forces were assigned critical objectives at Juno Beach. This wasn't charity or symbolism. This was recognition that when you needed a heavily defended beach taken quickly and held against counterattack, you gave the job to Canadians. On June 6, 1944, Canadian troops proved why. They landed on beaches swept by machine gun fire, churned by artillery, and covered by German defenders in hardened bunkers. Within hours, they'd punched deeper inland than any other Allied force, including veteran American and British divisions. The advance from Juno Beach became legendary. While other sectors struggled to secure their beachheads, Canadians pushed so far inland that German commanders feared their entire defensive line would collapse. By nightfall on D-Day, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had advanced nearly 9 miles, further than any other Allied unit. They'd taken heavily fortified positions, linked up with British forces, and established defensive positions that threatened German strategic reserves. More importantly, they'd done it with lower casualties than intelligence had predicted, because Canadian tactics emphasized speed and aggression over methodical advance. Now the pattern became unmistakable. Throughout the Battle of Normandy, Canadian forces consistently exceeded expectations. They took Caen after British forces stalled. They closed the Falaise Gap, trapping entire German armies. They advanced through France and Belgium faster than logistics could support them, forcing supply officers to improvise just to keep Canadian spearheads moving. German commanders began referring to the Canadian sectors as crisis points, where breakthrough was most likely. The transformation was complete when Canadians were assigned to clear the Scheldt estuary in October 1944. This was arguably the toughest assignment of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The terrain was nightmarish: flooded polders, narrow dikes, heavily fortified islands, all defended by fanatical German troops who'd been ordered to hold at all costs. British commanders estimated it would take months and cost tens of thousands of casualties. They gave the mission to the 1st Canadian Army, now recognized as the most effective fighting force available. What followed was a masterpiece of military operations. Canadian forces attacked through flooded terrain that military experts had declared impassable. They assaulted fortified positions from multiple directions simultaneously. They maintained pressure day and night, never allowing German defenders to rest or reinforce. They used combined arms tactics with artillery, armor, infantry, and engineers working in seamless coordination. The operation was completed in 5 weeks with roughly 12,800 casualties, far fewer than pessimistic projections, and it opened the vital port of Antwerp to Allied shipping. The German army now feared Canadian forces above all others. Captured German officers expressed genuine respect mixed with dread when discussing Canadian operations. One Wehrmacht colonel stated during interrogation that Canadian soldiers fight with British equipment, American supplies, and Russian fury. Another noted that defending against Canadians requires constant alertness because they attack when you believe attack is impossible. German defensive doctrine was literally being rewritten to address the Canadian threat. By early 1945, the contrast with Soviet operations under Zhukov became stark. Yes, Soviet forces were grinding toward Berlin through sheer mass and horrific casualties. Marshal Zhukov commanded millions of men and accepted staggering losses to maintain momentum. Soviet operations were sledgehammers, crushing everything through weight and numbers. Canadian operations were rapiers, precise and devastating, achieving strategic objectives with a fraction of the forces and casualties. The numbers tell the story. From D-Day to V-Day, roughly 240,000 Canadian soldiers fighting in Northwest Europe killed or captured an estimated 380,000 German soldiers. They liberated the Netherlands, northern France, Belgium, and significant portions of northwestern Germany. They maintained an operational tempo that consistently exceeded Soviet advances despite fighting with vastly smaller forces against prepared German defenses on interior lines. Pound for pound, man for man, no army in World War II was more effective than Canadian forces in 1944 and 1945. The liberation of the Netherlands revealed why Canadians inspired such loyalty. Other armies liberated territory. Canadians liberated people. They shared their rations with starving Dutch civilians. They gave their coats to freezing children. They played with kids in devastated towns. They treated the Dutch not as conquered territory but as friends who'd suffered under Nazi occupation. Dutch civilians would remember for generations that when freedom came, it came with a Canadian accent. Canadian soldiers wrote letters home describing the gratitude of Dutch families who literally had nothing left but thanked them with tears streaming down their faces. They described children so malnourished that they could barely stand, clinging to Canadian uniforms. They described elderly men and women kissing their hands and calling them angels. This wasn't propaganda. This was the reality of what happened when an army that genuinely cared about people fought to free them from tyranny. The fighting in the final weeks of the war was as intense as anything that had come before. German forces, now desperate and cornered, fought with the fanaticism of men who knew surrender meant facing justice for their crimes. Canadian forces had to clear fortified towns house by house, fighting die-hard SS units and Hitler Youth fanatics who'd been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was betrayal. The casualty rates remained horrific even as victory became inevitable. But Canadians never stopped. They maintained offensive pressure right up until the moment Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. That final push cost thousands more Canadian casualties, but it shortened the war by weeks and saved countless civilian lives. Every day the war continued meant more Holocaust victims murdered, more civilians caught in combat, more suffering. Canadians understood that speed and aggression, even at great personal cost, was mercy for those still trapped under Nazi rule. When peace finally came, the transformation in reputation was complete. British generals who'd once dismissed Canadians as undisciplined civilians now requested Canadian units for the most difficult operations. American commanders studied Canadian tactics and tried to replicate their aggressive approach. Soviet military observers noted with interest that a relatively small Commonwealth nation had achieved battlefield effectiveness that rivaled or exceeded their own massive armies. Most tellingly, captured German officers consistently rated Canadian forces as the most dangerous opponents they'd faced. The statistics are staggering when you really examine them. Canada's population in 1945 was roughly 11 million people. From this tiny population base, they'd fielded armies that killed or captured 380,000 enemy soldiers, liberated millions of Europeans, and fundamentally altered the course of the war in Western Europe. They'd done this while maintaining one of the lowest friendly casualty rates of any major Allied power, not because they avoided danger but because their tactics were so effective. Compare this to Soviet operations. Marshal Zhukov commanded millions of soldiers drawn from a population that exceeded 170 million. His victories at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Berlin were absolutely critical to defeating Nazi Germany, and no one can diminish Soviet sacrifice or courage. But Soviet tactics relied heavily on mass and attrition. Zhukov accepted catastrophic casualties as the price of victory. Soviet forces often suffered losses that exceeded German casualties even in successful operations. The Soviet way of war was effective but brutal, both to the enemy and to their own soldiers. Canadians achieved comparable battlefield results with radically different methods. They emphasized combined arms coordination, tactical flexibility, aggressive reconnaissance, and speed of decision-making at low command levels. They protected their soldiers' lives not through caution but through intelligence and initiative. When a Canadian unit took an objective, they typically did it faster and with lower casualties than equivalent British, American, or Soviet forces would have suffered in the same situation. This wasn't luck. This was systematic excellence born from their unique approach to warfare. The cultural factors behind Canadian effectiveness deserve examination. Canada in the 1940s was still finding its identity as a nation, distinct from Britain yet tied to the Commonwealth. Canadian soldiers weren't fighting for empire or ideology. They were fighting because fascism threatened freedom and someone had to stop it. This gave them a clarity of purpose that transcended nationalist fervor or ideological dogma. They were there to do a job, and the fastest way home was to do that job better than anyone else. The egalitarian nature of Canadian society also played a crucial role. Officers and enlisted men in Canadian units came from the same towns, the same neighborhoods, sometimes the same families. There was no centuries-old class divide separating leaders from followers. This meant Canadian soldiers trusted their officers to make smart decisions, and Canadian officers trusted their soldiers to execute those decisions with initiative and intelligence. That mutual trust created a battlefield effectiveness that more hierarchical armies struggled to match. Canadian tactical doctrine also emphasized what modern militaries call mission command. Instead of detailed orders specifying every action, Canadian commanders defined objectives and expected subordinates to figure out how to achieve them. A company commander didn't need permission to change tactics if the situation demanded it. A platoon leader could take initiative without fear of punishment if things went wrong. This created an army that adapted constantly, learning from every engagement and applying those lessons immediately. The veterans who returned to Canada after 1945 rarely boasted about their accomplishments. They'd done what needed doing, lost too many friends, and wanted to move on with their lives. Canada itself didn't trumpet its military achievements the way other nations did. There were no massive victory parades, no chest-thumping nationalism, no monuments to conquest. Canadians liberated nations and then quietly went home to rebuild their own country. This modesty meant that for decades, the world simply didn't know the full story of Canadian military effectiveness. But the people who were there knew. Dutch families knew who'd freed them from starvation. German commanders knew who'd destroyed their defensive lines. British generals who'd initially dismissed Canadians as amateur soldiers knew who'd consistently outperformed expectations. American officers who'd fought alongside Canadians knew who'd pulled off miracles when operations seemed stalemated. The soldiers who'd faced Canadians in combat knew that distinctive maple leaf insignia meant you were about to have the worst day of your life. The legacy of World War II fundamentally shaped Canada's national identity. Canadians proved to themselves and the world that they weren't just Britain's colonial junior partners. They were a nation capable of extraordinary achievement when the situation demanded it. They could field armies that operated with skill and courage that matched or exceeded any power on earth. They could liberate continents and change the course of history. All of this from a country with barely 11 million people scattered across the second-largest land area in the world. Modern military historians continue to study Canadian operations from World War II because they represent something unique. Here was an army that succeeded not through overwhelming resources, not through technological superiority, not through ideological fanaticism, but through intelligent application of combined arms tactics, aggressive initiative and genuine care for both their own troops and the civilians they were liberating. This combination proved devastatingly effective on the battlefield and earned loyalty and gratitude that persist generations later. The Dutch still celebrate Canadian liberation every year. Tulips bloom across Canada each spring, gifts from a grateful nation that remembers who brought them freedom. Schools in the Netherlands teach children about the Canadians who shared their rations and played with Dutch kids in the ruins of war-torn towns. Canadian flags fly in Dutch communities on Liberation Day. This is the legacy of soldiers who fought not for conquest but for liberation, not for glory but because it was right. The irony of British generals initially dismissing these troops as undisciplined civilians became apparent to everyone who paid attention. Those so-called civilians understood something that traditional military thinking had missed. Modern warfare wasn't about parade ground precision and rigid adherence to doctrine. It was about intelligent aggression, tactical flexibility, combined arms coordination, and maintaining relentless pressure on the enemy. Canadians intuitively understood these principles and applied them with devastating effectiveness. When you examine the operations in detail, the pattern becomes even clearer. At Falaise Gap, Canadian forces closed a pocket that trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers, shortening the war in France by weeks or months. In the Scheldt, they opened Antwerp to Allied shipping, solving the logistics crisis that was strangling the Allied advance. In the Rhineland, they cleared German forces from the west bank of the Rhine, setting up the final push into Germany. At every critical juncture, Canadian forces delivered results that exceeded expectations and altered operational timelines. The human cost was staggering despite their tactical excellence. More than 45,000 Canadians died in World War II. Another 55,000 were wounded. From a small population, these casualties represented a devastating sacrifice. Nearly every Canadian community lost sons, brothers, fathers, and friends. The psychological wounds of combat haunted survivors for decades. The price of defeating fascism was paid in Canadian blood, in shattered families, in dreams that died in the mud of France and the rubble of Germany. But those sacrifices were not in vain. They helped destroy the Nazi regime that had enslaved Europe and murdered millions. They liberated nations and saved countless lives. They proved that a free democratic nation with a small population could stand against totalitarian evil and win. They showed that you didn't need to be a superpower to change the course of history. You needed courage, intelligence, determination, and a willingness to do what was necessary even when the cost was terrible. The tactical innovations Canadians developed during World War II influenced military doctrine for decades. Mouse-holing through buildings became standard urban warfare technique. Aggressive night operations became doctrine in Western armies. Combined arms coordination at low command levels became the model for effective military operations. Mission command principles that emphasized initiative over detailed orders became fundamental to modern military thinking. Much of how Western militaries fight today traces back to lessons learned from Canadian operations in 1943 through 1945. The 380,000 enemy casualties inflicted by Canadian forces represent more than statistics. Each number was a German soldier who would never again threaten freedom. Some were convinced Nazis who fought for evil and got exactly what they deserved. Others were conscripts who'd been fed lies and propaganda, dying for a regime they never fully believed in. Still others were teenagers pressed into service in the final desperate months, dying before they'd truly lived. War is never clean or simple, and Canadian soldiers struggled with the moral complexity of killing even as they understood its necessity. Canadian veterans often expressed respect for German soldiers they'd fought against, even as they despised Nazi ideology. They recognized that many Wehrmacht soldiers were professionals doing their duty, however misguided that duty was. But they also never forgot what they were fighting for. They'd seen the concentration camps. They'd witnessed the devastation Nazi occupation inflicted on civilian populations. They'd liberated people who'd lived under tyranny and knew exactly what defeat would have meant for millions of innocents. That moral clarity sustained them through horrors that would break lesser men. When you compare Canadian operations to Soviet advances, the difference in philosophy becomes clear. Soviet forces under commanders like Zhukov were instruments of state power, crushing Germany through sheer mass and accepting horrific casualties as necessary. Canadian forces were citizen soldiers, fighting because democracy and freedom were worth defending, but never forgetting that every casualty was a person with family and dreams. Both approaches contributed to victory, but they represented fundamentally different relationships between the state and the individual. The speed of Canadian advances often shocked even Allied commanders. In the Rhineland campaign, Canadian units moved so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Quartermasters begged them to slow down so fuel and ammunition could catch up with frontline formations. Instead, Canadian units captured German supplies and kept going. They understood that momentum was a weapon, that keeping the enemy off balance prevented them from organizing effective defense. This aggressive operational tempo consistently destabilized German defensive plans. German commanders facing Canadian forces repeatedly made the same mistake. They assumed that because Canadians initially appeared informal and undisciplined, they would be easy to defeat. Then combat started and Germans discovered that these casual, friendly troops transformed into absolute demons once shooting began. The informal discipline that looked like weakness was actually a strength, creating bonds of trust and initiative that made Canadian units incredibly effective under fire. By the time German commanders recognized this, it was too late. Their defensive positions were overrun, their troops killed or captured, and Canadians were already advancing toward the next objective. The liberation of the Netherlands in particular stands as testament to Canadian character. German forces had deliberately flooded large areas, destroyed infrastructure and stolen food supplies, leaving Dutch civilians starving. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 killed more than 20,000 Dutch civilians. Canadian soldiers arrived to find children with swollen bellies from malnutrition, elderly people dying from starvation, desperate families eating tulip bulbs to survive. Instead of treating liberation as military victory, Canadians treated it as rescue mission. They shared their rations, organized food distribution, and prioritized civilian welfare alongside military operations. Dutch gratitude toward Canada remains intense 8 decades later. More than 1 million Dutch civilians lined the streets when Canadian forces marched through liberated towns. They threw flowers, wept openly, and embraced soldiers they'd never met but would remember forever. Canadian soldiers wrote home about Dutch families who invited them for meals even though they had almost no food themselves. They described children who learned to say, "thank you" in English just to express gratitude. This created bonds between Canada and the Netherlands that transcend typical international relationships. The battlefield innovations continued right until the war's end. Canadians developed new techniques for clearing fortified positions, new methods for coordinating artillery with infantry advances, new approaches to urban warfare that reduced civilian casualties while maintaining pressure on defenders. Other Allied armies studied Canadian tactics and tried to implement them, though often without the same effectiveness because they lacked the cultural and organizational factors that made Canadian methods work. You couldn't just copy Canadian tactics. You had to adopt the mindset that enabled those tactics. British generals who'd initially called Canadians undisciplined civilians had to eat those words publicly. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never shy about taking credit or assigning blame, specifically praised Canadian forces for their critical contributions to victory in Northwest Europe. American generals like Dwight Eisenhower noted Canadian effectiveness in official reports. Even Soviet observers acknowledged that Canadian operations demonstrated remarkable efficiency. The military establishment that had dismissed them now studied them as models of effective warfare. The comparison to Zhukov's operations isn't meant to diminish Soviet achievements. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of fighting Nazi Germany, suffered catastrophic casualties, and made enormous sacrifices that were absolutely essential to Allied victory. Without Soviet resistance, Nazi Germany would have dominated Europe indefinitely. Zhukov's victories at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin were turning points in world history. Soviet soldiers displayed courage and endurance that deserves eternal recognition. But the comparison highlights different approaches to warfare. Soviet operations often succeeded through overwhelming force applied with accepting massive casualties. Zhukov's offensives routinely suffered losses that would have been politically unacceptable to Western democracies. Canadian operations achieved comparable battlefield results through different means: tactical innovation, aggressive initiative, combined arms coordination, and protecting their soldiers' lives through intelligence rather than caution. Both methods contributed to defeating fascism, but they represented different values and different relationships between military leadership and the soldiers who did the fighting. The final offensive into Germany tested Canadian resolve one last time. German defenders, now fighting on their own soil with their backs against the wall, resisted with desperate intensity. Every town became a potential fortress. Every bridge crossing was contested. Canadian soldiers faced not just Wehrmacht regulars but SS fanatics and Hitler Youth teenagers who'd been brainwashed into believing that death was preferable to surrender. The fighting was savage, personal, and exhausting. Canadian forces maintained their tactical excellence even as battle fatigue and war weariness took their toll. They'd been fighting for years. They'd lost countless friends. They were tired, traumatized, and wanted nothing more than to go home. But they never quit. They kept advancing, kept fighting, kept maintaining pressure until Germany finally surrendered. That final push cost thousands more Canadian casualties, but it ensured the war ended as quickly as possible, saving countless lives on all sides. The moment of victory, when it finally came on May 8, 1945, was bittersweet for Canadian soldiers. They'd won. They'd defeated Nazi Germany. They'd liberated millions of people. But the cost had been terrible. Too many friends would never come home. Too many small-town Canadian boys were buried in European soil. Victory brought relief and grief in equal measure. They'd done what needed doing, but the price would haunt them forever. The return to Canada was complicated for many veterans. They'd experienced things that civilians couldn't understand. They'd seen humanity at its worst and occasionally at its best. They'd learned to kill efficiently and to cope with fear and horror. Reintegrating into peaceful society proved difficult for many. Some struggled with what we now call PTSD, though at the time it had different names or was simply ignored. Others threw themselves into building families and careers, trying to put the war behind them. Most rarely spoke about their experiences, keeping their memories private and painful. Canada itself changed profoundly because of World War II. The nation that entered the war in 1939 as Britain's colonial junior partner emerged in 1945 as an independent middle power with a distinct identity. Canadian military performance had earned respect from allies and enemies alike. Canadian sacrifices had proven the nation's commitment to freedom and democracy. Canadian achievements gave the country confidence in its own capabilities. The war forged modern Canadian national identity in ways that persist today. The strategic impact of Canadian operations extends beyond battlefield statistics. By maintaining aggressive pressure in Northwest Europe, Canadian forces prevented Germany from shifting troops to the Eastern Front against the Soviets. By liberating the Netherlands and opening Antwerp, they solved logistical problems that threatened to stall the entire Allied advance. By achieving objectives faster than planned, they shortened the war and saved lives. Every week the war ended earlier meant fewer Holocaust victims, fewer civilian casualties, and less suffering. Canadian speed and effectiveness literally saved lives through military excellence. Modern military analysts studying World War II operations consistently identify Canadian forces as among the most effective Allied armies. When you adjust for factors like unit size, resources available, quality of opposition, and casualties inflicted versus suffered, Canadian divisions rank at the top of Allied effectiveness measures. This isn't nationalist propaganda. This is documented historical analysis from scholars around the world who've studied operational records, German assessments, and comparative battlefield results. The personal stories behind the statistics reveal the human dimension of these achievements. There was Leo Major, the one-eyed French-Canadian scout who single-handedly liberated the Dutch city of Zwolle by running through the streets at night making so much noise that German defenders thought they faced a major assault and withdrew. There was Francis Pegamagabo, an Ojibwe sniper from Ontario who became one of the most effective snipers in military history with 378 confirmed kills and who repeatedly volunteered for the most dangerous missions. There were thousands of ordinary Canadians who did extraordinary things because the situation demanded it. These weren't supermen. They were farmers and fishermen, factory workers and store clerks, teachers and students who answered their country's call. They were scared teenagers who grew up fast in the hell of combat. They were young men who wrote letters home assuring their mothers they were fine while sitting in muddy trenches under artillery fire. They were ordinary people who found courage they didn't know they possessed and did things they never imagined themselves capable of doing. That's what makes their achievements so remarkable. They were us, thrown into circumstances we can barely imagine, rising to challenges we pray we never face, The cultural impact on Canada resonates through generations. Every November 11th, Canadians gather at cenotaphs across the nation to honor veterans and remember the fallen. The sacrifice of World War II soldiers created expectations about what Canadians should stand for. The nation's modern identity as peacekeepers and defenders of international order traces directly to lessons learned from fighting fascism. Canadian foreign policy, military doctrine, and national character all bear the imprint of what happened in Europe between 1939 and 1945. The dismissive British generals who initially called Canadians undisciplined civilians never fully admitted how wrong they were. Some quietly changed their assessments in official reports. Others grudgingly acknowledged Canadian effectiveness while claiming credit for training and leadership. A few honestly admitted they'd completely misjudged the situation. But the evidence speaks for itself. By every measure that matters, Canadian forces proved to be among the most effective Allied armies in World War II, achieving results that exceeded their size and resources through superior tactics, aggressive initiative, and genuine commitment to liberation rather than conquest. The number is stark and powerful: 380,000 enemy casualties inflicted by Canadian forces. Behind that number lie thousands of individual engagements, hundreds of battles large and small, countless moments of courage and sacrifice. Each casualty represented a German soldier who would never threaten freedom again, whether they were convinced Nazis, reluctant conscripts, or deluded teenagers. Moral complexity exists in war, but so does moral clarity. Those enemy casualties were the price of defeating fascism and liberating Europe. Canadian soldiers paid that price with determination, skill, and a level of tactical excellence that their critics never imagined possible. When you compare that achievement to what Marshal Zhukov accomplished with vastly larger forces, the Canadian accomplishment becomes even more impressive. Zhukov commanded millions. Canadians fielded hundreds of thousands at peak strength. Zhukov accepted casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Canadians achieved comparable battlefield effects with far lower losses. Zhukov's offensives relied on mass and attrition. Canadian advances relied on speed and intelligent aggression. Both contributed to victory, but the Canadian approach demonstrated that effectiveness doesn't require sheer mass if you have tactical excellence, initiative, and determination. The lesson from Canadian World War II performance resonates today. Don't judge capabilities by appearances. Don't confuse informal culture with lack of discipline. Don't assume that soldiers who question orders are ineffective. The most dangerous opponents are often those who think differently, who don't follow your playbook, who adapt and innovate faster than you can respond. British generals learned this the hard way. German commanders learned it too late. The world learned that a relatively small nation with the right approach could achieve military effectiveness that rivaled superpowers. If you've made it this far in this incredible story, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now to show your respect for these forgotten heroes. Share this video with anyone who loves history or needs to understand what real courage looks like. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories about the incredible people and events that shaped our world. Drop a comment telling us what aspect of Canada's World War II contribution surprised you most. Did you know about their effectiveness before watching this? What other underreported military histories should we cover? Your engagement helps us continue sharing these important stories. The legacy of Canadian forces in World War II extends far beyond military history. It proved that democracies could field effective militaries without abandoning democratic values. It showed that citizen soldiers could match or exceed professional armies when fighting for a just cause. It demonstrated that small nations could make enormous differences in world events. Most importantly, it revealed that the character of a nation, its values and culture, could be military assets as significant as equipment or numbers. Canadian soldiers went to war as farmers and lumberjacks, store clerks and students. They returned as veterans who'd helped save the world from fascism. They'd killed 380,000 enemy soldiers and liberated millions of civilians. They'd fought through some of the most brutal combat in human history and maintained their humanity in the process. They'd proven that you could be informal and friendly off the battlefield while being absolutely lethal in combat. They'd shown that tactical innovation and aggressive initiative could overcome numerical and resource disadvantages. They'd become, by any objective measure, one of the most effective fighting forces in World War II. British generals eventually learned their lesson, though some never fully admitted their initial misjudgment. Future military operations would request Canadian participation because commanders knew they could count on Canadian units to achieve their objectives. The reputation earned through blood and courage became institutional knowledge within NATO and Western military establishments. When you needed something done quickly and effectively with limited resources, You wanted Canadians doing it? That reputation persists today in Canadian Special Operations Forces and peacekeeping contributions. The comparison with Zhukov highlights a fundamental question about military effectiveness. Is it better to achieve victory through overwhelming force regardless of casualties, or through tactical excellence that protects your soldiers' lives while accomplishing the mission? Soviet doctrine said one thing. Canadian practice demonstrated another. Both defeated Nazi Germany, but they represented different values and different approaches to warfare. History shows both can work, but the Canadian approach aligned better with democratic values that saw soldiers as citizens in uniform rather than expendable resources. For the Dutch people who lived through liberation, the question of effectiveness versus humanity never arose. Canadians were both. They were devastatingly effective warriors who destroyed German defenders with ruthless efficiency. They were also compassionate liberators who shared their rations, played with children, and treated civilians with respect and dignity. That combination of battlefield excellence and human decency created bonds that transcend normal international relations. Canada and the Netherlands remain close today because of what Canadians did in 1944 and 1945. The personal cost to Canadian soldiers is easy to overlook when discussing tactics and strategies. Behind every statistic was a human being who suffered, who feared, who bled. Many carried physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. They had nightmares about friends dying beside them. They struggled with survivor's guilt. They dealt with injuries that medicine in the 1940s couldn't fully treat. They made sacrifices that we benefit from today but can barely comprehend. Honoring their memory means acknowledging not just their achievements but their suffering. The transformation from dismissed civilians to feared warriors took less than 3 years of active combat. In that time, Canadian forces established a reputation that still resonates in military circles. They proved that unconventional approaches could be devastatingly effective. They showed that citizen soldiers with the right training, leadership, and motivation could outperform career military professionals. They demonstrated that a nation's character translates directly into military effectiveness. These lessons remain relevant to military planners and historians studying the nature of warfare and national power. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about Canada's role in World War II, if it gave you new respect for what citizen soldiers can accomplish when fighting for something that matters, then please, take a moment to engage with this content. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story with others who need to hear it. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or asking questions about aspects we didn't cover. Your engagement helps ensure these stories don't get forgotten, that the sacrifices and achievements of these remarkable soldiers continue to inspire future generations. The ultimate measure of Canadian effectiveness in World War II isn't just the 380,000 enemy casualties or the territory liberated or the battles won. It's that they proved democracies could defend themselves without becoming what they fought against. They showed that free people fighting for liberation could match or exceed totalitarian armies fighting for conquest. They demonstrated that values matter, that how you fight reveals who you are, and that it's possible to be both effective warriors and decent human beings. In a war full of moral complexity, Canadian forces mostly managed to maintain both tactical excellence and ethical integrity. British generals who called them civilians fighting poorly had to watch as those same civilians liberated nations and destroyed German armies with efficiency that matched or exceeded anything traditional military establishments produced. The lesson is clear. Never mistake informality for incompetence, never confuse unconventional approach with lack of capability, and never underestimate people fighting for something they believe in. Canadians believed in freedom, democracy, and the necessity of stopping fascism. That belief, combined with tactical innovation and aggressive execution, made them one of the most effective military forces in human history.